Hello again. So this week we've got a little bit more UV unwrapping to do, and then we were going to move on to actually applying some image textures to our scene. First, I want to take this video and hopefully a shorter video. I just want to talk about unwrapping pipes and cables. A little bit trickier than what we've done so far. Obviously, they're not a flat plane, and they're not kind of geometrically rigid 90-degree boxy shapes. So what happens when we try to unwrap something a little bit more complicated? So I'll start with this pipe here, and then I'll work up in kind of in complexity. It's not going to get too complex because it's all going to be the same process, but I just want to show it to you on a few different forms. So let's just dive right in. I'm going to go into local view on this pipe, and real quick, just in case you're skipping into this video and didn't watch the last couple, we want to make sure we have the UV squares add-on enabled. If you just search UV in the add-ons, just make sure that's checked. You can find it online if you can download it from GitHub if it's not bundled in there for some reason. It should be though. There's also a paid version, which is the exact same program from what I understand. It's just that money goes towards helping the development of this software. So UV squares, we want that. And then once we have that, let's get into this pipe. So let's expand out this area a little bit. I am in the UV editing workspace. I am going to apply our UV test grid to this object so we can kind of see where we're at. And initially, not great. As you see, it's just using the default UVs. So let's select everything and hit U and unwrap. You can see it's terrible. We haven't marked any seams. We can look at a cylinder projection for this, which if we open up the options and change it to polar ZY, no, neither of those are working. Sorry, we're not going to use that anyway. I was going to see if we were going to get close, but it still wouldn't work on the flat faces. So what we're going to do is first cut our seam. And if we get out of local view here for a second, we want to find a place that seam is not going to be super noticeable. And I'm going to say on this one, we're going to go on the top side. Because most of the time the camera's probably going to be down here. If it does end up on the top, we can always just take the whole object and rotate it around the y-axis and just hide that seam for whatever camera angle we have. But for now, there's no reason to worry about it too much. We're just going to cut a seam along the top. So I will Alt click on that, and also let me turn on screencast keys so you can see what I'm doing. Cool. All right, so I am Alt clicking on this edge, and we will mark that seam. See that turns red. Select everything, U, and unwrap, and see how we do. I'm going to go back to material preview, and it's better. Obviously, the body of the pipe is looking pretty good, but the rest of it, we're getting some distortion. If you remember, we want these squares to be roughly the same size throughout. That's going to equate to equal what's called texel density, which is texture pixel density. So if we have, we've got our image on our grid, we want the same amount of detail, the same relative scale across it. So we need to cut some more seams. Let's look at our modifiers and see what we've got going on there. Subdivision, that's fine. We've got it off in edit mode, which allows us to see some of these internal edges. If we turn that on, you can see that gets a little harder to see. So got that off. I'm going to cut or mark this seam in there. It's a nice sharp inside corner that we're never going to notice that seam. That's good. Unwrap that again so you can see that that part's now cut off. And now we have this base area that we want to do the same thing. These little inside corners are usually a pretty decent place to consider cutting seams, because they're less likely to notice anything. We'll mark that seam. The outside corners you're more likely to notice a seam there, and it's also they were more likely to unfold flat. So got that internal corner. We're gonna add one to this one as well. Mark that seam. Let's look at the back side here. And we've got a little bit more geometry here than we really need. So I'm going to take this edge and I will scale it up. You could also double tap G and slide it if this was... I can scale this up because it's a planar edge loop. If this wasn't all on one plane, see if I look at the side view, it's flat. Then I would just double tap G and scale it up. I'll select these inside edges here, and I'm just going to delete those. We don't need them. We're never going to see them. Okay, so now let's unwrap again. And looking better. See, the body of this pipe actually unwraps perfectly, so we don't have to worry about that. But we've got a few other places that need a little bit more work because we want them to stay pretty flat. You see, we can see this super obvious seam here, and you get a little bit of distortion because this should be a flat grid, and it's clearly not. Same thing here on the side. You see how we've got a curve going on, so let's work on correcting that. Start with this flat piece here. I'm going to actually take this seam from here, and I'm going to hold down Control and select to here, and right-click and clear that seam. Now you can see also when I deleted before, I deleted the edges. I probably should have deleted the faces because it left these vertical edges. So let me just select all of those and X delete edges. Make sure we don't have any floating vertices around there. We're good. All right. Nope. Looks like I missed one, so we'll delete that vertex as well. Okay. Back into material preview so we can see our UVs. Now if we unwrap this one more time. Okay, so that's now flat. That's looking pretty good. We can double check our stretching here. See, there is a little bit of a, actually on the front face, it's not too bad. See, on the back here, we've got some curves. We can check our UV stretching here. And to hide that, get that out of the way. You see, we're pretty good. It's all blue. It gets to lighter blue around the last face, which if we swing around to the back side here, is going to be this, this face loop. And again, that's not really going to be seen, so we don't have to worry about that. Okay. And hover over the island in UV mode, select it all, and rotate it just so it's relatively flat. Like that will work. All right, so now we've got just these two islands here that aren't completely flat or square. So let's fix that. I'm going to turn off sync UVs, select everything in 3D space, go to my UV editor. Now this is where the UV squares add-on comes into play. What we want to do is we're going to use an option called UVs with grid, UVs to grid with respect to shape. And that's basically the same thing here. If in the UV editor we go unwrap follow active quads. And what that's going to do is it's going to take whatever face is the active face, which is this highlighted one, and generally that's going to be like the last one that you select. So if I select multiple faces, you can see it'll follow the last one. Or if I hover over this and hit L to select linked. By the way, on select linked, I have delimit seam, which means that selection will stop at seams. If I disable that, or just leave it on normal, and select it, hover over it, hit L, you can see it selects the whole thing. But if I turn on seam, it's going to stop at seams, which is pretty useful for UV unwrapping. So yeah, if I hit U and follow active quads, we can set this to length average, that's fine. You see that it's more of a grid, but it's distorted. And that's because the face that I chose, if I undo that, and we'll turn on sync selection again so we can see, excuse me, this face isn't perfectly square. And that's why it unwrapped at an angle, because it's following this quad. And so the face that's next to it is going to go in that direction. So we need to straighten that out. And without UV squares, what you would do is you would select these two UVs and you would scale them along the Y to 0. And then you would do the same thing with the side UVs. You would scale them along X to 0. And then that way you would make your square quad. But with square UVs, it's a whole lot easier, or UV squares, it's a whole lot easier. I'm going to turn off sync selection because this doesn't work if you have sync selection on. But we want to grab a face that's roughly in the middle. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit L, and I'm going to select the whole UV island. Let me also turn off stretching so that we can see our UVs a little bit clearer. Okay, so we can select this face, and then hover over it, hit L. That's going to select the whole island, and then all we have to do is go to UV and UVs, unwrap UVs to grid with respect to shape. Alt-E is a shortcut. You can also hover over it and hit Q. Oh, maybe not. Maybe it won't let me. Oh, no, you right-click. Hover over it, right-click, and you can say Add to Quick Favorites. Okay, so now when I hit Q, it'll pop up my quick favorites. If you don't want it there, then you can just right-click and remove from quick favorites. I'm just going to use a shortcut, so Alt-E. And now it unwraps it in a perfect grid, and we can look at our 3D view, and it's looking quite beautiful. So we need to do the same thing over here. Now sometimes if we look at these UVs, it's not perfectly square. It's usually best to start with a face that's kind of internal, also average sized, and already pretty close to square. So I'm going to rotate this just a little bit to kind of flatten it out. And then once I have that, I can hit Alt-E, and that's going to be these faces down here. Okay, so now we have all of that unwrapped. I can select everything, Q, and average island scale. See, there's a little bit of adjustment there, and Q and pack islands. If you missed it before, I did in the UV menu, average island scale and pack islands. I put them right there, but I did right click and add them to my quick favorites because I use them all the time. I want to disable rotate when I pack the islands, and then these actually, both of these islands can rotate in this case. So I will rotate them 90 because that's going to make the pack a little bit better. Q and pack the islands. Okay, so that is unwrapped. I'm going to do that a couple more times here. We'll get out of local view there. And we can go up top here, and we'll do the same thing up here. Actually, we don't need to. The reason we don't need to is because this is actually a linked duplicate. When I duplicated it, I hit Alt-D instead of Shift-D so that the UV is transferred, which is great. There's one last thing that I want to do now that I have them both unwrapped. I'm going to select them both. I'm going to go to Object and Relations and make single user, Object and Data. Okay, so now they're not going to share UVs anymore, which means I can tab in Edit Mode, select them. Or actually, I don't know if I need to do that. Hold on. Let me undo that. I'm going to go into my Object Data Preview, because this will tell me when I undo back far enough to have them be duplicates. Okay, so now you see this little 2 popped up. That tells me that they are sharing object data, that there's 2 objects using this data. So let's select them both, tab into Edit Mode. Yeah, I can't unwrap them both separately. So I can go back up to Object, Relations, make single user, Object and Data, or I could just click this little 2. And now that'll make the active object unique. So I got them both selected. Now I can tab into Edit Mode, select them both, and then in my UV editor, Q average island scale, which they are the same, so that's fine. And then I can pack the islands. Now that I have them both unwrapped. Now, why would you want to do this? Well, if we didn't do this, when we added a texture to them, they would both be textured the exact same way. Which, if you notice that repetition, and it depends on the texture if you would notice it, but if you notice that repetition, then it's going to detract from the believability and the realism of the scene. So we want to give them unique textures. They can still use the same texture image, but we want to give them unique textures. So I'm going to separate them that way. All right, so now that we have that, it's going to be the same process for every other cable or tubular object in our scene. Okay, so we can go to this large pipe right here, and we will give it our UV test grid. Let's check our modifiers. That's good. We'll turn off subdivision in edit mode. Also check our object data, make sure that our scales are applied, and they are. Great. Now, You can see that I have added some horizontal edge loops here, and that's just going to help with the texture mapping and the shading of it. You may want to even add a few more. Not super necessary, but sometimes it can help with the shading. Also can help with the unwrapping. So we'll add our edge loops here. So we know we want to add them on the inside. We'll do that down there and there. And down here at the bottom. That one. Mark the seam. Grab this one. Let me add period. Zoom in there and we'll mark that seam. Okay. We have that. We're going to need to figure out what the back side of this is. Zoom up here. And we'll go right here. Actually, we'll go on this one. And let's mark that seam. Okay, select everything and unwrap. See what we're working with. It's looking pretty good. You see the body of the pipe unwraps perfectly. We don't have to worry about that. The corner, however, did not unwrap perfectly. So let's go in here and select that island. I'm going to rotate it a little bit to kind of flatten out that face. Actually, I'm going to grab one of the faces on the side. And we'll sync selection so you can kind of visualize this. Okay, so this is the piece I'm working on. And I want to make sure I grab a side face here. Actually, looks like I more or less have one. Something like this. Because you can see that we've got larger faces here and smaller faces here, so we want more of an average size face. So maybe we'll go with this one. And then I will select that and rotate it a little bit. And now if we hit Alt-E right now, it's going to tell me, please disable Keep UV and Edit Mesh and Sync. So we just have to disable that right there. And then we can reselect our island and hit Alt-E. And then we can check our unwrap there. Okay, and so that's going to be pretty good. Now, I do see that there's some little stretching on the outside of the bend and some pinching on the inside of the bend. Not a whole lot we can really do about that when we don't want to have any extra seams. If you were fine adding seams, then you could add some relief cuts across, but then you would see those seams unless you were using something like Substance Painter that, or just manually painting over those seams. But if we don't want to paint over every seam, then I think we're pretty good there. All right, so it's going to be the same thing for the rest of this. I'll select this island, and I'll rotate it a little bit. Find a face that is, let's go with maybe this face. L, Alt E. That's good. Same thing here. Select a face. L, Alt E. And same thing here. L, Alt E. So once we have everything unwrapped, select it all, hit Q, average island scale, and then pack islands. And then let's take a look at our work and see how we did. Okay. Now you can see this bottom little plate here. We're getting a lot of distortion there, so let's unwrap this one a slightly different way. I'll hover over that, hit L to select it. You can see that this is what we have. I'm going to select the seam here. All right, and I'm going to clear that seam. Also looking at the bottom here, grab these faces and just delete them because we don't need them. They're not doing anything useful. All right. So if I select this and hit U and unwrap it now, this is what we get. We had the same thing up on the other pipe. Let's look at our stretching. And okay, it's all going to be red, and that's because it's comparing that to every other UV. So we'll select everything and average the island scale, and we'll repack the islands as well. Now it's not, we're getting some asymmetric distortion, and that tells me that this isn't perfectly circular. So if we look around here, we can kind of see that. It's a little tough, but it's there. So what I'm going to do is I want to cut a little bit of a few more relief seams. So I'm going to select this ring of edges. And to do that, just Control Alt and left click, and I'll select that face or that edge ring, and I'm going to mark those seams. So we're not going to see those seams because those are on the ground, but we are keeping those bottom faces because that helps taper the bottom edge of this, and it just gives a little bit more place for the shadows and the light to interact and give a little bit more realism and weight to the object. So once we have that, we can just hit L, and we will unwrap. I just want to unwrap this part again, because if I unwrap the whole thing, like if I go in here and hit U, it's going to unwrap everything, and I have to straighten that back out again. But I can select just this island and hit U. Oh, it's going to select everything again. I want to do that over here. Over there, make sure seam is enabled. Just select that, U, and unwrap. Okay, so you can see how those relief cuts come into play. This is much more circular. Now we can select everything, average island scale. Come on. Everything, Q, average island scale. There it goes. And pack islands. That's more circular. That's more square. And everything is looking pretty good. The last thing I'm going to do, just because it's going to bother me if I don't, is I'm going to select this island and rotate it 180 degrees so that the texture is running in the correct and readable way. Okay, so that's it for that pipe. That you would do that exact same thing on these pipes. One note about these pipes, when we modeled them, I did use a bevel. I'm going to, when I unwrap them, and I guess I'll do this real quick as I'm talking about it, I'm going to remove the bevel, because if we apply it, you have to go into edit mode to do so. But if we apply that bevel, you can see we used 4 subdivisions, and there's just not a clean corner. Also, it just adds a little bit more, a few more faces than we really need. So I will undo that, get rid of the bevel, and we will turn off subdivision surface in edit mode as well. Then we just have to quickly add in our holding edges. Go to local view and solid, maximize it so you can see what I'm doing. But this is nothing new here. Add our edges there. We'll add one on the side here. And same thing up here. Let E to keep that even on these, but E, F to flip it. Okay, so now that we have all of that, you can see again we have an extra face loop down here, so we'll delete those faces. And we're going to unwrap this the exact same way, so we don't really have to worry too much about it. We'll just add in the same scale. Oops. We'll scale this up a little bit too. We'll add in the same seams that we did. So let's find a backside hidden edge, which this edge is going to work great for that. So we'll mark that seam, see if we come out of local view. That seam's still selected. It's going to be very difficult to actually see that seam in the texture, no matter how we move the camera. So that's a great place for it. And let's add in our seams. We got our inside corners. We'll add those seams. We're going to deselect this one and Control Alt click on those edges and mark that seam so that will unfold flat. And then up here, we will mark that seam as well. And we can mark those edges as well because that'll help that unfold a little bit flatter. All right, we'll select everything, U, and unwrap it. Okay. You can see this is one long piece, so we have to be a little bit more careful here. But we will select this face. Actually, no, we're going to select this face. It's going to be a little bit more average. Before I do that too, see we've got these really long extended faces. I'm going to add some edge loops in there just to help with the texturing. Okay, so now we have that. We'll go with, yeah, we'll still go with that face. We'll turn off stretching and hide that. So I'm going to hit L to select everything. I'm just going to rotate it a little bit. Okay. And then Alt E, and there we go. Same thing here. Hit L. See, actually, because we're unfolding this straight, we don't really need these edges. So I'll reselect those edges, and I'll clear the seam on that. Then hover over that, hit L, and just re-unwrap that one. Oh, I think I missed. That's right, because I do need this one edge right here, so that continues. So we'll mark that seam. L, unwrap that. Okay. So same thing, we will rotate this and then Alt E. Select everything here. We got this last one to do, so I'll select that. L, let's rotate that a little bit more vertical. And Alt E. Select everything. Q and average island scale and pack islands. Let's take a look with our UV test grid here. And that's looking great. No complaints. So you see we've got a little bit of distortion around the bottom edge here. It's pretty minimal though, so I'm not going to worry about that. And so you could do the same thing. The one next to it, select them both, tab in edit mode, and pack them together the same way that we did with these two. And actually, when I did this for real, I packed all three of these together. It's your option. We're not optimizing for game assets, so that doesn't really matter. But it can be, if you are using the same texture, it can be nice to kind of help make sure that the texture size is the same, so that you don't have, because this pipe is a little bit larger, or even if we compare these two, right? You can see that the squares on this are really small, and the squares on this are much larger. So if I apply the same texture to them, the texture is going to appear larger on this pipe, and they're not going to feel like they belong in the same world if they have two different size textures. So packing them together, or not, I mean, we could even just, we could select them both, and then Q and just average the island scale, and then you could manually pack them. Oops, I didn't have everything selected. Select everything, average island scale, and then if we pack them, then they're going to be the same relative size. Okay, so let's move on to the cables. Going to work the same way. So I'm going to grab just this cable right here. It's just all this is a curve. I am going to bring the resolution preview down to 12. And then we can right click and convert to mesh. Okay, so there's our mesh. We're just going to select an edge on the back side, right there, mark seam. And then we can select everything and unwrap it. This is what we get. You can see there's a lot of distortion there. So let's assign our UV test texture. And really all we need to do is find a face in the middle. Let's say this one. Select everything, Alt E. And now we have a nice clean grid running through the whole thing. And hit Control 2 just to add a subsurface modifier at level 2. Smooths that out nicely. And that's the cable. Again, I would unwrap all these cables, and at least these two cables, and maybe these as well, and just pack them together. These cables work the same way once you apply them. So I will select this. And this one is actually made with an array modifier, but it's going to work the same way. So we're going to, in object mode, we're going to apply our array modifier, apply our curve modifier. Okay, and so it's just 3 cylinders that are kind of wrapped around each other. So we can unwrap them the same way. It's going to grab an edge. Now, because there's a twist, this seam is going to run through the whole thing. So, if there's a very obvious pattern, you're going to see that seam, just the nature of the unwrap. So either if you're using Substance Painter and you can paint over those seams, or you just paint over those seams in Blender, or you would just give it a kind of solid, consistent thing. or you use a, well, no, even using a borderless texture wouldn't really work because the seams wouldn't line up. But when you unwrap that, you'll see we've got the same thing going on here. So it's just as simple as grabbing a relatively square face. Let's say like this one will work. L, Alt E, and L, Alt E. Select everything. Whoops, not unwrap. Average island scale and pack islands. There you go. Okay, so that's unwrapping pipes and cables. Um, yeah, works the same for everything else. I will mention real quick on these, we want to make sure when we apply our modifiers, we have our array and we have our curve, and we want to make sure that we have merge first and last copies together so that these stay connected. Otherwise, you'll just need to, after I apply them, select all the vertices and merge by distance. You can see I removed 24 vertices there. And then you can unwrap that the same way that you would everything else. So good luck. There's a few more cables. You can see up here on these long cables, when I added these brackets, I talked about it. I did add seams right in there vertically behind the brackets, so you can kind of chop them up, and you don't have one long face only taking up a small fraction of this. It breaks it up a little bit more.